If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please don't hesitate to type them in your chat box. I'll be checking that periodically and making sure that we answer all the questions that you all might have today. And so we are going to go ahead and get started. First, I want to note that we are going to be talking this morning purely about sexual identity and sexual orientation in terms of the LGBT community, and talking about how to serve those folks who are not heterosexual within shelters and crisis centers. As you all know, sexual orientation is not the same thing as gender identity. Trans folks or gender nonconforming folks can and do identify as heterosexual or straight. So we will be talking about some of the unique issues and challenges facing transgender and gender nonconforming survivors next week in the next session of our Underserved Population series, and you can still register for that on our website at tncoalition.org. But today, again, we are going to focus on sexual orientation and sexual identity. I also want to make a note on the language that we'll be using. You are going to see LGBTQ or LGBTQ often referenced throughout today's webinar. And so I wanted to make a note on the Q, which often stands for queer. Historically, this has been a very derogatory term, and it is still offensive to many folks who are in the LGBT community. However, many others have reclaimed this as an umbrella term to describe someone who is not straight or someone who is attracted to multiple genders. And it is also a word that's often used in academia in terms of queer studies. So it is a word that is multifaceted. We know that in many communities, particularly rural communities, it is still a word that is incredibly derogatory and is used to harm folks within this community. So it is a term that I would not use with a client unless a client specifically identifies in that way and asks for you to use that term in relation to them, because it is such a complex and emotional word. So why are we talking about this morning? How big is the problem? Well, the Williams Institute reports that around 4% of the population identifies as LGBTQ. So about 4% of the population identifies with a sexual identity or sexual orientation that is not straight. And what we do know about that 4% is that it's probably actually a low estimate, because many people, even on anonymous polls, are afraid to identify as not straight, not heterosexual. But even with the 4% number, which again we think is low, that means that around 264,000 people in Tennessee identify as not straight or not heterosexual. So over 200,000. And so I really want you to take a moment to think about how many people you have served within your agency, your crisis center, your shelter, your outreach center, wherever type of organization that you work within, how many people you have served that identify openly as LGBTQ, and is that reflective of what we know the overall population to be? And the other important and big reason that we're talking about this is not only that this is a very large population of people that deserve and need services, but because there are unique barriers and considerations for this group of survivors. And we know that many crimes against historically marginalized communities go underreported. So we really have to think about our advocacy and how we strive to provide equitable, holistic, and compassionate services for these survivors. And so also thinking about not only how many individuals within the state of Tennessee or within the United States as a whole identify as not straight, not heterosexual, but also the rates of victimization. So if we're looking at rates of victimization, roughly 35% of straight women report having experienced rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner. 35% is already a huge number, right? 35% is already incredibly startling and concerning. But then if you look at the rates of victimization for bisexual women, which is at 61%, or lesbian women, which is at 44%, then you understand that within this marginalized population, the rates of victimization are huge. And that's the same for men as well. So straight men, rates of victimization are roughly 17%, which is already startling enough. But that rises to 37% of bisexual men and 26% of gay men. And partially this is because the vast majority of hate crimes or harassment toward the LGBT community are sexualized in nature. So most hate crimes that are directed toward gay or bisexual men and women have a sexual harassment, rape, sexual abuse component. So this is an incredible problem, and it's an issue that we all need to be thinking about as victim service providers and as people who are advocating for victims within these communities. Okay, there's one question that says that I have heard the Q was used for those questioning their orientation. It is. It's used for queer and questioning, just like you'll sometimes see other letters in the acronym that are used for multiple things. It is predominantly used for queer because questioning, while many people may be questioning their identity or orientation, questioning in and of itself is not an identity, if that makes sense. But yes, it can be used for both depending on the way it's used and the context. All right, so a quick note about the law and what the law says in terms of our services to LGBT folks. So in a 2010 study by Sexual Assault Centers prosecutors' offices, law enforcement agencies, and child victim services, 94% of respondents said they were not serving LGBTQ survivors of intimate partner and sexual violence. So basically, the National Center for Victims of Crime partnered with the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs in 2010 and did a huge study, a nationwide study of sexual assault centers, prosecutors' offices, law enforcement agencies, child advocacy centers, shelters, any kind of victim services providers, and found that roughly 94% of those providers said that they were not serving LGBTQ victims, which is a huge number, and it's very startling when we think about what we just talked about in terms of the rates of victimization, right? So the law changed in response to this research and other research around this issue. The Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act in 2013 added a grant condition that, among other things, prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender or sexual orientation. So VAWA worked to eliminate some of this discrepancy and discrimination within services. And so the grant provision they added names several protected classes that qualify for equitable services, including naming gender and sexual orientation as protected classes that you cannot discriminate against. However, even though that provision was added to the law, 44%, as recently as 2015, 44% of LGBTQ survivors were denied access. So basically, the Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs did a follow-up study 5 years later in 2015 after the 2013 VAWA anti-discrimination policy went into place, and they found that barely more than a quarter of LGBTQ survivors who sought refuge at shelter were given access. 44% were flat out denied access. The most common reason for that denial was barriers related to gender identity. Okay, so we are still really, really struggling to serve these individuals, even with protected laws in place. So FIPSA and VOCA also echo the VAWA language, and so to be in compliance with FIPSA and VOCA standards, supports must be accessible to all survivors. So all of the services that you provide within your organization, if you receive FIPSA money or VOCA money, must be accessible to all survivors. Accessibility is a broad requirement that includes offering shelter and all core services to victims regardless of gender and sexual orientation. So, do we have any questions so far about the law or language or anything that we've talked about? I'm going to check the question box, so if you have anything, you can go ahead and send me a question in your chat box. All right, I don't see any questions at this time, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. But again, please feel free to enter questions as we go, and I'll periodically stop and check on that. So, in addition to tactics that are commonly used by abusers in any relationship that involves domestic violence, there are some power and control tactics that are unique to LGBTQ relationships. So things like the use of privilege, incorporating biased language and slurs into verbal abuse, utilizing institutions that may be oppressive to LGBT survivors, like courts and child welfare systems, exposing the survivor to hate violence, outing the survivor, using children. So things like, you're not their real parents. I'm going to use legal action to make sure that you can't have access to the children. I'm going to tell your child's father that you're in a same-sex relationship. I'm going to take the child to somewhere that won't recognize our relationship, refusing to allow a same-gender partner to adopt or foster. And remembering that there is little or there may be little or no social validation for these individuals, so that the people in the survivor's life, like their family and friends, may not even recognize or accept that they are in a same-sex relationship, much less recognize that they're being abused and take measures to help them. And that many people are closeted and can't turn to friends or family at all, right? So that's a double-edged sword. For some people who may be out technically, they may still have family or friends who don't support their sexual identity and orientation and don't recognize their relationship at all, and so won't give them help for the abuse. And then some people, are afraid to be out or can't be out for whatever reason, so they can't come to family and friends for help when they're in an abusive situation or when they experience sexual assault. So that the only place or the only support system they have to turn to may be a shelter or a crisis center or other victim service agency, because they have no contact with or support from family and friends. And so again, there are some unique barriers and some unique ways that abuse plays out within LGB relationships that differ from heterosexual or straight relationships. So for instance, questioning the validity of a survivor's sexual orientation. If you were really gay, or if you were really, if you really loved me, you would do this thing, or, you're not bisexual, bisexual is not real, you're just pretending, controlling what someone wears or how they express their sexuality, using homophobic or biphobic slurs when they're abusing them. So using some of those really vile name calling against their partner, degrading or humiliating them based on HIV status, blaming the survivor for the abuse or denying or minimizing the abuse, pressuring the partner to come out before they're ready or in a dangerous situation or a dangerous area, convincing the partner of danger or rejection if they reach out to other people for help, convincing the survivor that no one will help them because they're LGBT. And it can also be things like, we're in a place, maybe we live in a rural community where it's not safe to be publicly out. So the abuser tries to hold the survivor's hand or do something in a public place that, in a heterosexual relationship may be just simply showing care and showing love, but in this particular situation where it's dangerous to show those types of affection publicly, this may be a threat or a fear tactic toward the survivor. Examples of physical abuse or intimidation. Stalking can be easier if the partner is the same gender. So for instance, I could call, if my partner was the same gender as me, I could potentially call a doctor's office and pretend to be my partner and say, oh, hey, I forgot what time my appointment was, can you remind me? And find out details of my victim's schedule or where they would be at what time to make stalking them easier. Using mutual abuse myth. So this idea that this myth that in same gender relationships it's not domestic violence, it's just a cat fight or it's just boys being, roughhousing or whatever. So this idea that they're never going to believe you, they'll just think it's just cat fighting or that it's not real, so they're not going to help you if you reach out. Threatening to out the partner's sexual orientation, HIV status, or other personal information to employers, parents, friends, the community, their faith community. Being LGBT is not a protected class in all states. It is not a protected class in Tennessee when it comes to employment. In general, there are some exceptions. So people can be fired and have been fired for being outed. People can be ostracized from their communities for being outed. So this is a very real threat and a very real intimidation tactic and a very real isolation tactic. Well, if they really understood you, they would accept you for who you are. I'm the only one who really loves you, and therefore you have nowhere to go to get away from me. Examples of sexual abuse in LGBTQ relationships: not respecting words that a survivor used to describe their body or body boundaries, forcing a partner to have sex in a way that doesn't align with their sexual orientation or sexual or gender identity, using the myth that women cannot rape other women or that men cannot be raped to deny or discount sexual assault, using the idea that men want sex all the time to pressure a partner into sex when they don't want it. All of these are ways that sexual abuse can play out in these relationships. So here is a little snippet of a quote from a male survivor who was in a same-gender relationship. After a lengthy courtship during which I was treated like gold, my partner and I moved in together. Almost immediately, he began to turn on me, demanding separate rooms, bringing strange men home for sexual encounters, subjecting me to verbal abuse privately and in public. At one institute, he started an argument, slapped me, pushed me into oncoming traffic at an intersection in front of a very populated cafe. So, the levels of violence and terror that play out within same-gender relationships are the same as the levels of violence and terror that play out in any domestic violence relationship. And also things like this, like bringing strangers home for sexual encounters, exposing your partner potentially to STIs because of that, is another piece of sexual abuse that plays out in many domestic violence relationships that we don't often think about. Using economic abuse in LGBTQ relationships. Getting someone fired from their job can be easier if your partner is the same gender. If I call my partner's employer and say, hey, I quit, or call my partner's boss pretending to be them and say something terrible to get my partner fired, it's much easier because I'm the same gender. I don't have to disguise my voice necessarily to pretend to be my partner. Identity theft, again, it's easier if the partner's the same gender because I can call or potentially even go places and use a credit card or call my partner's bank and pretend to be them, or use a credit card that has the name of my gender on it, and most people would not blink an eye, right? Threatening to out partner your partner to their employee, parents, or relatives who may be helping with tuition, housing, or utilities to get them fired or to get that financial help withdrawn. In addition to tactics used by the abuser, we also, as advocates, have to consider societal factors that isolate LGBTQ folks and make it more difficult for them to seek help. So for instance, I already mentioned, someone may be closeted, may not be out, and cannot turn to friends, family, or faith communities for support. Homophobia, biphobia, these things do some of the batter's work for them by isolating the survivor, destroying their self-esteem, and really convincing them that no one will help them because of their sexual orientation, sexual identity. There is a greater likelihood of no arrest, wrongful arrest, or dual arrest when calling the police on a same-gender couple, and no restraining order or dual restraining or competing restraining orders given by judges in the cases of same-gender couples. There are, in general, simply fewer resources available for LGBTQ survivors than for heterosexual or straight survivors. Oftentimes, there's a lack of screening or there's a lack of understanding of how to determine who is the primary aggressor and who is the survivor by police, courts, even shelters and support groups. There may be LGBT community pressure not to air dirty laundry within the community because there's so much negativity aimed toward these marginalized communities already that there's this idea that we can't talk about it for fear of bringing more negative attention. So according to shelter housing needs for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender victims of domestic violence, an overwhelming number of these victims, 57%, become homeless due to abuse, with a large number, 18%, reporting that they lose everything. The same report explains that there are significant gaps in the critical continuum of services for these victims, including adequate shelter. Although some domestic violence organizations extend services to this community, many have not received the training that they need to provide equal services and may inadvertently discriminate against LGBT folks. Others simply lack policies and procedures in place to handle homophobia or biphobia from not only staff, but other program participants. So we're going to get into best practices and the way that your organization can start to take a trauma-informed approach to really, truly supporting and adequately serving LGBT folks. Again, if you have questions at any point, make sure you're typing them in the chat box, and so I can make sure to answer them. So, using gender-neutral terminology, using the term survivors rather than women when referring to the people you serve. Use a variety of pronouns to reflect the unique genders of all survivors. Using the term abusive partner as opposed to man, husband, or batterer. Provide a variety of support options for residents to choose from that will be inclusive to the different communities you serve. Be flexible so that you can offer groups that meet the needs of the people currently in your program. Create residential rooms that can be connected or separated via locked doors to create bigger or smaller spaces and Think about privacy. If you do not have the ability to alter your space, use your existing space creatively so that people from marginalized communities are not excluded. Provide gender-neutral or private bathrooms. Consider ways you can communicate with residents that your facility is inclusive, beginning at intake when you describe your shelter's practices and protocols. If residents or other clients do or say something homophobic or biphobic, address the issue in the same way you would any other discriminatory remarks or behaviors, just as you would with racist or sexist slurs. Provide in-depth staff training and discussion about how to support the specific needs of LGBT residents and survivors that you serve. You cannot and should not judge or guess someone's sexual orientation or identity based on their appearance or mannerisms. Don't assume, right? Don't assume that someone is straight or is gay. Remember that even if somebody is coming into your shelter, even if a woman is coming into your shelter because their abuser was their husband or their abuser was a man, so the relationship that they were in with their abuser was a heterosexual relationship, that survivor may be bisexual, they may still identify on the LGBT spectrum, so you don't necessarily know and can't assume that just because no one has identified to you that they are in that community or a part of that spectrum that you're not already serving LGBT clients and just may not know it. I was grateful for a place to hide, but shelter was one of the most uncomfortable situations I have been in. Instead of being able to deal with my current situation, I had to deal with the other women's issues about my sexuality. I was asked not to be gay in front of one woman's child. I couldn't talk about my situation as everyone else at the house had trouble understanding how I could be battered by another woman. In this case, the discrimination came directly from the other residents in the shelter, but the shelter staff did not adequately address the harassment or protect the survivor. Harassment of survivors continues in many programs and is often left unaddressed because staff either don't see it or maybe staff are uncomfortable or don't know how to address these issues. And this denies equal services to survivors. If somebody comes into your shelter and they are being taunted or abused or discriminated against, then they are not receiving equal services and they are not safe, frankly. They are in your agency and they are not safe from discrimination and abuse, then they are not safe at all. Some survivors who face these issues may choose to leave and return to their abusers, while others may rather be homeless. So when we're thinking about responding to discrimination within shelter from either staff or other residents, first of all, be ready. You know at some point that you will hear or see something that is inappropriate or discriminatory. Prepare yourself for it and ask questions instead of making accusations. Things like, why did you say that? Or do you really mean what you said? Prepare yourself ahead of time and think of strategies for how you can intervene if and when this happens. Don't punish, instead correct and model behavior, right? For instance, Carol is a woman, the appropriate pronoun to use for her is she, or if you would not ask other residents about their sex life or their sexual orientation, don't ask Jane. Or if you would not like someone to ask about your sexual identity, don't ask other people. Intervene appropriately. As an advocate, you're responsible for setting the right tone. consider when and how you challenge behavior. Do you challenge behavior there and then? Will that be the most effective for the person involved and the people witnessing? Assess whether it's appropriate to have the conversation in public or behind closed doors. You may want to say something to the group as a whole so that they know that discrimination is unacceptable, but you may want to have an additional conversation behind closed doors with the person who is being discriminatory. Reflect and reframe. Do not repeat insults or do not repeat the abusive language, but instead reflect on the overarching message and help the person understand that what they are saying is wrong. Appeal to principles. If you think that you can get through to someone by calling on their higher principles, by saying, you know, I've always thought you were a fair person who is very loving, and it really shocks me to hear you say something that's so hurtful to other people. Make sure that you set limits. You can't control the behavior of clients, but you can make them aware of what you will and will not accept. We don't tell those kinds of jokes or use that language in shelter. Everyone has the right to be safe here. What you just said was disrespectful. We don't accept discrimination. Set your healthy limits and boundaries. So we had a great question. It says, do you agree that it is helpful to talk about and address our eligibility criteria with residents? Meaning consistently reminding residents that we do not discriminate based on gender, sexual orientation, etc. So it is not a shock if we do have a man or transgender resident in shelter. Absolutely. I think that is a great practice to have in place. I think that that's something that you should discuss with every client and you should discuss often, so that when people are entering your organization, or when people are entering your shelter as a resident, they are aware up front that it is an inclusive, welcoming environment and that they are going to probably be living with a variety of people who are different from them. So yes, I think that's a great practice. So just as important as having clear non-discrimination policies and procedures is actually modeling respectful behavior towards LGBTQ individuals in all aspects of your organization. When staff and residents treat each other with kindness, compassion, and respect, others will generally mirror those behaviors, which results in an environment that cultivates wholeness. There needs to be a commitment from the very top to create an environment in which everyone is respected and feels secure enough to bring in all parts of themselves. And if you are not aware, Michael Munson, who wrote this lovely quote, is the executive director of Forge Forward, which is a transgender, basically action organization for helping trans folks who've experienced domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and also they're a national training and TA provider for organizations who work on these topics. And again, that organization is called Forge Forward. So thinking about providing equitable services, first of all, making sure that your staff are trained, that your staff are respectful and open, and that they're not using biased or discriminatory language, that they know how to intervene when they hear a client using that kind of language, that they're comfortable intervening, making sure that any service that you provide to one client, you're also providing to all other clients, so that you are not that you're not discriminating in services, that you're providing things like support group or advocacy or case management to all clients, regardless of their sexual orientation and identity, regardless of their gender identity, regardless of immigration status, all of those things. We know that domestic violence in this community is a serious issue, and that rates are the same or higher than those for heterosexual women. One of the unique factors, though, is that seeking help and services involves coming out to a possibly unprepared and hostile neighborhood, court, police force, etc. This is a dangerous barrier for these victims that increases the risk we experience. We also know that a relationship with a local advocacy program can save a potential homicide victim's life. For this reason, among many good reasons, your outreach and work within this community can and will save lives. So some more things that you can do. Research LGBTQ-friendly support services, counseling, and medical services in your community. That way you know you're sending clients to a place that will treat them with compassion and respect. If they don't exist within your community, consider a partnership to train providers in your community on LGBT inclusion. So let me be very clear in cautioning you that just because you may feel comfortable referring a heterosexual female survivor to a certain therapist within your community does not mean that that therapist is LGBTQ friendly, okay? Does not mean that that partner organization is LGBTQ friendly. So really do your research and make sure that you are not referring LGBTQ clients to organizations or counselors or partners that are not going to treat them with respect. And I understand that in rural communities, you may not have any or many partner organizations or resources that are LGBTQ friendly, and maybe it is as simple as partnering and offering to train those organizations on how to work with LGBT clients. But if you're hitting a lot of walls, it may come down to really having to partner with organizations that are outside your normal service area so that you have a safe place to refer individuals to. Acknowledge that LGBTQ survivors may have different experiences of their abuse and may use different words. Mirror the language that they use to talk about themselves, including the way that they describe their gender identity, the way that they describe their sexual identity and orientation, their experiences. For example, some people in this community may be uncomfortable with terms like domestic violence because that can be seen as a heterosexual issue, or it's an issue that they have been left out of for so long that they might describe what they've experienced in a different way. Organizations should invest in opportunities for education, skill building, and best practices for staff. Furthermore, they should support the leadership of LGBTQ people on staff, on boards, and in advisory capacities. Organizations should consider creating signage and materials in an office environment that depicts members of the LGBT community and important touchstones with those communities. Think about LGBTQ magazines in your waiting room, gender-neutral bathrooms, pamphlets about LGBTQ health, and materials from partner organizations about these issues. Don't make assumptions about who the abuser is. Review your intake documents for gender-neutral language. Use words like partner in both written languages and speech unless the survivor tells you otherwise. Acknowledge the fear that some LGBTQ people have about the police. Acknowledge that they may have experience with police or other systems being homophobic or minimizing partner violence within same-gender relationships. Some survivors may also fear putting a member of their community through a criminal justice system due to negative experiences of these systems. They may also fear that the criminal justice process could mean being outed. So really consider that, already domestic violence and sexual assault is underreported, but LGBTQ folks may have additional fears and concerns about working within criminal justice system. Advertise your services in, potentially a local paper or a community center with emphasis on LGBTQ outreach. You may also, want to reach out to non-traditional places like clubs or other places that LGBTQ community in your area may go to as a safe place. So you may have certain clubs or bars or places, community centers that are centered within the LGBTQ community where you might want to think about reaching out or advertising your services. So there is another question that is, if our agency was able to get a group of counselors together to attend a training, would the coalition be able to provide a local training in our community regarding serving the LGBTQ population? Absolutely. That is absolutely something that we can do in your community or in communities all across the state. We actually have a couple of trainings coming up in August that individual organizations are calling us out to talk about these exact issues. So we would be more than happy to work with any organization to offer training on serving the LGBTQ community. So we're going to do a quick little activity, and I'm going to have you answer, if you feel comfortable, answering in the chat or question box. If you can write about how a person entering or seeking out your agency, how would they know that they are welcome to be out as an LGBTQ person? What overt or covert information would tell a person that it is okay or not okay to be out? So if somebody is looking for your agency or somebody is seeking your services, how do they know that they are welcome to be out as an LGBTQ person? Okay, we have a couple of answers. Um, Someone said that all of our client welcome packets discuss how we do not discriminate based on gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. Somebody said that it is included in the literature we distribute. I think these are both amazing things. You know, I've talked about making sure your materials and your intake packets and things have inclusive language. And I think that that is a wonderful and necessary piece of the puzzle here in terms of serving this community. But I also want you to think about how people know if it's a safe space before they come in contact, before they come in for an intake, right? So if they are looking at your organization's website, if they're looking at your organization's social media, if they are talking to other members of their community or friend group, or if they go to a specific community center or belong to a specific faith community, what are they going to hear or see about your organization before they come into contact with a staff member, right? Before they reach out for an intake? What is that going to look like? Someone else said we have signs that all are welcome that include the LGBT population's Rainbow Center. Our staff are all welcoming and accepting. Our handbook includes that LGBT folks are welcome. All of those, again, are wonderful things. I think particularly signage and things that you're distributing within the community so that, again, if somebody is deciding where do I need to go to services, who can I reach out to, they may make a decision on the front end before they ever make that phone call to you if you're a safe organization or not. So being thoughtful about how you're projecting that image into the community before someone even makes contact. And I will be sending out the PowerPoint when I send out your all's certificate of attendance. I will also send out a copy of the PowerPoint, absolutely. So the next thing I want to think about is thinking about your agency's outreach materials. Do the materials use inclusive language? Do the materials name the issue of battering and sexual assault in the LGBT community? Most of you have already, several of you have already kind of answered this. Someone said outreach to local support groups to provide presentations and inviting leaders to our shelter and ask for recommendations on how to be welcoming. That's an amazing strategy. That's very well done. You know, really going out to chat with people, but also inviting them to give you some insight on how to best approach the communities that they're a part of, right? Making sure that you're bringing members of the marginalized communities to the table when you're working on interacting with them. The last thing that I want to ask then is about agencies' policies. Is discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation prohibited in service delivery, hiring practice, and other policies and procedures? And do your recruitment efforts, as far as you know, do your recruitment efforts for staff, volunteers, board members, etc., actively recruit LGBT folks or other marginalized people? So I'll give you a minute to answer that if you feel comfortable answering. All right, so we had a couple of people who said that LGBT discrimination is absolutely prohibited, that there are specific policies regarding this, that you all do make sure that this is written into policies and procedures, which I think is amazing. But these are just, some questions that I want you all to be thoughtful about, even kind of as you're going back to your organizations and hopefully taking the information that you have learned today and talking to your staff or your supervisors about the ways that you can improve or expand your services. Um, so I want to leave you with this quote. This has nothing to do with gender, sexuality, race, or culture. It has everything to do with how we treat and love people in our community. So what I'm asking for is continued support and also much, much more support, because I believe that if I went back to my partner, I would have died. And I don't want that for myself. I don't want that for my sister. I don't want that for any man, woman, or child on this earth. So I am going to stick around for a couple of minutes here so that if you have any questions that you would like to ask, you can put them in your chat box. Also, as you can see, my email address is on the screen. Yes, there are 2 H's, 2 R's, and 2 N's. That is not a typo. Please make sure you use all of the crazy letters in my email address or it will not come to me. But if you do have any questions or concerns or things that you want to chat about outside of the webinar, things that you think about later, or if you want to talk about bringing the coalition to your community to do additional training on this topic, feel free to reach out to me and let me know. As I said, I will be following up with an email with your certificate of attendance for the webinar, as well as a copy of these slides. And thank you again so much for being on with us today. I really appreciate all of you and have a wonderful rest of your week.